Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Wallace here in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm an evolutionary epidemiologist with the People's CDC here with an update on the COVID-19 pandemic. We have another two-parter this week. In the first part, we review global COVID and U.S. COVID, covering the latest in long COVID and what Americans are saying about their new COVID infections these past couple weeks. In the second part, we'll unpack the Biden talking point that we don't have to do anything about COVID because, quote, we have the tools. We begin with the global COVID situation. The World Health Organization data are in terrible shape, with few countries reporting in or reporting in impossible zeros. But we see from these percent changes in caseloads the past couple of weeks, rebounds there, and the warm colors are still scattered across the globe. Morocco, Ireland, England, Italy, Czechia, Poland, Lithuania, Finland, Romania, Moldova, Georgia, Kuwait, with slight increases in Bangladesh, Thailand, and Vietnam. We do see from the Economist data set of the 7-day average of excess deaths per 100,000 a flattening out toward pre-pandemic levels. No countries reporting September 3rd showed excess deaths beyond a half a person per 100,000 population. That indeed converges upon the notion of a lesser COVID pandemic. However, The Economist also reports that excess deaths remain 5% above pre-pandemic levels, even as reported COVID caseloads have bottomed out and total mortality measures are scant beyond the global north, making this estimate less precise over time. In the meantime, much of the world is at best vaccinated for variants no longer circulating. We see uneven campaigns in booster vaccination across the world. On the one hand, Peru, Uruguay, Argentina, Cuba, Belgium, Italy, Finland, and Japan showed top-tier booster campaigns with 80 or more booster shots administered per 100 population. In contrast, we see near nothing in Russia, India, and Pakistan, those even reporting in from Africa, as well as mediocre campaigns in Central America, Spain, and Eastern Europe. This map seems like it hasn't changed much. With fewer countries reporting in, these campaigns appear largely to have ground to a halt. Indeed, the CDC reports the U.S. stuck at 18% of its eligible population 5 years and older with an updated booster dose. We can see from this time series a combination of some countries no longer reporting in, but almost a universal tailing off of new vaccinations since spring 2022. Meanwhile, the mediocre vaccination campaigns, hand in hand with the rollback in the non-pharmaceutical campaigns that successful vaccination depends on, have been taking place alongside the continuing emergence of multiple Omicron subvariants now circulating across large expanses of the world. As of August 14th, a couple weeks out of date, we have XBB 1.16 in fern green, XBB 1.9 in aquamarine, and EG 5.1 in gray blue, leading the way in these 6 global north countries. With CH1 in magenta, prevalent in Australia and Spain, XBB 1.5 in baby blue in the US, and other sublineages in orange across the board. Here are a few other countries beyond the US and Europe. We try to mix these up week to week, depending on which countries are up to date. The Dominican Republic is hosting EG 5.1, BA 2.75, and XBB. Iceland and Singapore are hosting all 2023 strains, XBB 1.5, XBB 1.16, XBB 1.9, XBB 2.3, and EG 5.1. Israel is also hosting that lineup along with XBB. Japan is hosting XBB 1.5, XBB 1.16, CH 1.1, XBB 1.9, XBB 2.3, EG 5.1, and a 2022 throwback, or maybe never gone away, BA 2.75. And the Philippines is hosting XBB 1.9, XBB 2.3, and XBB. China has a lot of XBBs, but especially many of the newer sublineages that had to be renamed because all the new division numbers added on. FU.1, EG 5.1 appear in decline. EG 5.1.1 is in full throttle, and FY3, FL2, and FL4 are widespread. Here's the global diversity of COVID genetic sequences as of August 26 and 20 days back. EG5 sublineages are surging in red. We see the FLs in pink, XBBs 1.16 in green, and XBB 1.5s in orange. We see the beginnings of the DVs in blue in the middle. That the world is still hosting such a large zoo of variants makes this map green in both validity and soundness, even if not every single lineage has been sequenced everywhere it really exists. In the face of the declines in country reports, one could use the molecular clock and the accumulation genetic variation month to month to estimate the total number of infections. Now, that's a phylogenetics the People's CDC is beginning to look into, but such analyses are not easy to do from scratch. And the People's CDC is not a $12 billion a year federal agency like the CDC. And this zoo is exploring a wide evolutionary space in which to experiment with attaching to the ACE2 receptor to enter the human cell as modeled on the horizontal axis and evading the human immune response on the vertical axis. Both axes are standardized relative to BA2 scores. Most of the sublineages are in a sweet spot of binding and escape. They are in the upper middle with the same colors from the previous diagram. EG1 and 2, some of the FLs, XBB 1.5s, and XBB 1.16. A few others appear to lurch ahead in immune escape, as in that XBB 1.5.44 and XBB 1.28.1 on the top, along there with a couple FLs. A second cluster on the left, including EG5s, appear to be evolving out in immune escape, but with lesser capacity for binding to ACE2. One could imagine those on the left leading a charge to escape out from underneath host immunity before their offshoots circle back to better ACE2 binding. Now, whether that second option lets these sublineages spread across the world is another question. The point is that this is very much evolution in motion. The pandemic is still very much in play. Indeed, the newest worry is BA 2.86, there at the top, undergoing 30 amino acid replacements compared to its progenitor BA2. At least 25 isolates have been sequenced across multiple countries: Denmark, Sweden, Portugal, UK, United States, Canada, South Africa, and Israel. Wastewater expert Mark Johnson identified an isolate in Ohio water sampled July 30th. Others have been identified in Virginia, Texas, and Michigan. BA 2.86 is an ancestor of old BA2 and not part of the XBB renaissance. We see here it's showing maximum escape and slightly better ACE2 binding. It has a P681R replacement in the receptor binding domain. That is, the proline amino acid at spike protein position 681 has been replaced by an arginine amino acid that previous work showed optimized furin cleavage in the Delta variant that permitted easier infection and faster progression to illness. A Japanese team showed in 2021 that a P681R construct, as depicted in orange, produced more syncytia or fused host cells on the left and greater fusion activity on the right, leading to more host damage. Meanwhile, the N-terminal domain of the spike protein has a 12 nucleotide or 3 amino acid insertion that functionally acts as another furin cleavage site. Molecular virologist Mark Johnson proposes this one is an example of the virus self-modulating in the sense that the virus picks up this one from its own ORF1b gene, which is involved in viral replication. Now, whether this parses out as a worse infection remains to be seen. Unfortunately, like other COVID data, the kind of genomic surveillance that alerts us to such threats is in steep decline. Yes, as the red box indicates, there's usually a lag time from isolating samples to sequencing them to uploading them. But the GIST-AID database's graph here indicates such surveillance has been in linear decline since last year, about the time when the Biden administration declared the emergency would be terminated in May. New research continues to characterize the impacts of allowing SARS-2 to free range this way and evolve all those new variants. Indeed, it's increasingly apparent long COVID isn't unusual. Previous work we described here on COVID this week showed SARS-2 continuing to replicate 2 years after initial infection in organs across the body, even in patients who have, quote, recovered. It's now apparent that outside a few cases with SARS-2 fully cleared, there is no such thing as short COVID. Almost all COVID infections are long COVID, with, as summarized here, persistent replication, often leading to exhausted immune response, cytopathic damage, viral reactivation, and persistent inflammation. A new study tracks long COVID 2 years post-infection across 12 classes of symptoms, including cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, neurological, and mental health. We see here heat maps of relative risks by days after infection plotted over several time periods labeled by the period's last day up to 2 years. Each symptom is divided in 2 rows, the top for the nearly 120,000 patients included in the study who were not hospitalized during the acute infection, and for the bottom row, the 20,000 plus who were hospitalized. The relative risks were estimated in comparison to a non-infected control of nearly 6 million people. Now, the darker the orange, the greater the risk. Grays indicate no statistical difference with the control. Now, while most of the 80 conditions here declined in impact over the 2 years, 2/3 of them remained significant in those patients who were hospitalized, and 1/3 of the symptoms remained significant in those who were not hospitalized. In reviewing the study and another of U.S. veterans, medical doctor Wes Eli noted these levels of disability exceed those of cancer and heart disease. As if damaging multiple organ systems wasn't enough. Other new work shows COVID causes persistent damage to our mitochondria. That's the organelle that produces our cells' energy. Indeed, the editor for a new Children's Hospital of Philadelphia study on this topic declared, quote, chronically impaired mitochondrial function ultimately may result in serious COVID-19 sequelae, such as organ failure, end quote. In the short term, such damage may account for long COVID patients' exercise intolerance and out of proportion fatigue. But this also speaks to an attack on our very cellular bedrock. SARS-2 may be more than just about hijacking our replication machinery for its own reproduction. The Philly team compared mitochondrial gene expression in tissue samples taken from the nasopharynx of 216 people with COVID and 519 without. They also looked at mitochondrial function in autopsy samples from the hearts, kidneys, livers, lungs, and lymph nodes of 35 people who died from COVID as compared to that from 5 people who died from other causes. The team found energy production suppressed in the nasopharynx during acute infection, and in those who died with COVID, and energy suppression in the heart, kidney, liver, and lymph nodes. They also found energy suppression expressed in the brain, even when no SARS-2 were directly detected there. We see here heat maps for gene expression in the mitochondria's oxidative phosphorylation complexes 1 through 5 and the ribosomal proteins in the nasopharynx. Gene expression was particularly disturbed in intermediate and high viral loads, with some being strongly downregulated in blue and other genes strongly upregulated in red. Now, there may be a basis for treatment here. The team found SARS-2 boosted the expression of MIR2392, a host protein involved in lowering mitochondrial gene expression. But also, given that the viral load is driving the damage, getting vaccinated and masking up should help in protection. Given COVID-19 is acting as a coagulopathy, impacting so many organ systems, producing, among other things, endothelial damage and micro and macro clots along the way, it shouldn't be a surprise that the damage is impacting treatments for other illnesses. A new report shows COVID induces additional clotting in patients taking anti-cancer drugs. These force plots of risk ratios here show such clotting, especially for venous thromboembolisms on the left across anti-cancer drugs, immune checkpoint inhibitors, immunomodulators, tyrosine kinase inhibitors, and vascular endothelial growth factor inhibitors. Reinfection doesn't help matters. It doesn't necessarily offer the kind of immune protection presumed under the notions of herd immunity or hybrid immunity, that is, the combinations of natural infection and vaccination. Indeed, previous studies we covered here on COVID this week showed the more infections, the more likely one will suffer long COVID. A recent McMaster University study found seniors getting infected with Omicron more likely to be reinfected. Indeed, the Toronto Star reports, quote, retirement and long-term home residents infected during the first Omicron wave were 20 times more likely to get reinfected by the virus than those who avoided a prior infection, end quote. And it wasn't due to immunosuppressant medications or the crowded nature of these residential settings or from age or from frailty. Clearly, the best treatment for COVID-19 is prevention. It's in not getting the infection in the first place. Turning to the US, the Walgreens COVID-19 Index of National Test Positivity covers both rapid tests and PCR. As of August 27th, we see a slight decline in positivity to nearly 44% of all tests Walgreens processes, still greater than for previous spikes. We see the number of tests increasing, which may in itself serve as a measure of incidence. State public health departments still reporting in or showing lower positivities, like 5 to 20%, although also increasing. Part of the high positivity rate here may be people with clear symptoms coming in to confirm their infection in a way asymptomatics have largely been detracted from doing so by U.S. public health policy. But both this index and the state positivities there are being reported as higher. Suddenly, everyone is trying to couple together some picture of the outbreak in the way the People's CDC has been doing since the end of the emergency declaration. CNN reports, quote, weekly hospital admissions have nearly doubled over the past month, including a 19% bump in the most recent work, CDC data shows, and a sample of laboratories participating in a federal surveillance program show that test positivity rates have tripled in the past 2 months, end quote. Now, if you recall, we reported in COVID this week, those laboratories are far fewer than before the end of the emergency and constitute volunteer reporting the labs aren't obligated to participate in. With the end of the declared emergency, official county and state health departments are no longer obligated to reporting caseloads and deaths. A decline in reporting it was already in motion, true, but also hand in glove with decreased laboratory testing, increased home testing, changes in reporting practices, and what were earlier this year, more asymptomatic infections. In their stead, the CDC replaced the almost always all-green map of community levels at the county level with another nearly all-green map of percentage of provisional deaths due to COVID. We no longer have access to the raw numbers, although we could roughly infer them by calculating the average total deaths per week for 2023 for each state, and then multiplying that by the percentages on this map, even as these are also likely underestimates with long COVID left out. But we see here an increasing number of states back to as many as 4% of their weekly deaths attributable to COVID: Florida, Tennessee, North Carolina, Maryland, New York, and Washington State. The CDC reports the latest round of excess deaths associated with COVID during the pandemic in blue, and those associated with non-COVID causes in yellow, that second line of red pluses there, above the expected average deaths based on the 6 years before the pandemic. The last excess death count shown here above the threshold in the red pluses for both COVID in blue and non-COVID in yellow is shown here to be January 21st. The thing is, though, it appears CDC is rolling back its updates to monthly, even on the variables it's agreed to continue to report. Infectious disease modeler J.P. Wayland is using wastewater data from BioBot and CDC seropositivity to project us to 621,000 new COVID infections in the U.S. alone for the single day of August 31st. Wayland hasn't released a detailed methodology which sets the validity here at red, although the general gestalt is probably on point. If these estimates are anywhere close to reality, both global and U.S. data should now be rated junk, and the pandemic is hardly over, especially as we described, the virus has been given the public health green light to continue to explore its evolutionary possibilities. Epidemiologist Isaac Michaels is continuing to map community transmission based on testing caseloads that CDC abandoned, at least for his home state, New York. The state has undergone a clear surge with only one county presently hosting moderate or low transmission. The state registered 63 confirmed COVID deaths this week, 1,371 COVID hospital admissions, and the positivity rate that nearly tripled in the past 2 months to 15.2%. The important point here is that even with deteriorating quality in data, with hospitals nationally reducing the reporting, COVID-1 continues to evolve as an outbreak, no matter the repeated propagandistic declarations that the pandemic is over. And 2, the virus continues to qualify as a public health threat by the old standards the administration abandoned. With the CDC abandoning mapping transmission at the county level, we're forced to look elsewhere, as was described in the CNN report that we reviewed. Hubbub offers prevalence per area or within a 5-minute walk by U.S. county using CDC and state public health department data. As People's CDC Andrew Wang warns, however, Hubbub assigns 0 cases to counties that aren't reporting in. And the underlying calculations are proprietary and therefore hidden from the public, which forces us to again assign red to its validity, if only by dint of omission. But we could select a few sentinel states that appear to be still reporting. Here's cases per area for New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, California, Florida, and Arizona, which together account for 110.5 million Americans, or a third of the US population. There's also the issue that cases per area may be more of an allometric marker of population size than anything. The bigger you are, the larger everything is. But area isn't necessarily protection against infection, as rural counties found out from mid-2020 on. The big picture here is that spatial temporality matters, especially if any actual program of intervention were to be operationalized. As People's CDC Les Schaffer has commented, averaging by state alone has a way of flattening out any emergent outbreaks. In that spirit, we'll add here that we wish to avoid the obscurationist holism that everything is the same everywhere, missing the very hierarchical diffusion down the population network at the heart of epidemiological spread, right? So you have outbreaks either coming into New York or starting there, places like New York, LA, Chicago, before they get blown out back to the rest of the country. Indeed, that everything isn't the same everywhere is what helped drive the underlying failures of the pandemic response. The initial outbreaks occurred on the coast, which encouraged a Republican president to wave off the political cost of the pandemic, followed by a Democratic president the second year doing the same to the red states. We see here the Phoenix outbreak intensified since last week. The Bay Area, Los Angeles, Miami, New York City, Northeast New Jersey have fallen back a bit, but still host high incidence or prevalence per area. Philadelphia has likewise declined, but nearby Montgomery County has increased. The school year has only begun in some parts of the country, and COVID emergency room visits for adolescents have already risen, with some school districts already canceling classes. These school districts would not have done so except under dire circumstances, particularly in states like Kentucky and Texas, with COVID histories on the side of reopening early and often. The problems with quant data in an analysis move us to take a more mixed methods approach. Against media efforts to cherry pick on the street interviews to the effect that the pandemic is over, we're now collating posts from Americans who are getting sick despite the administration's declaration they're not supposed to be sick now that the pandemic is over. A COVID This Week listener has been collating people's Reddit, Facebook, and Twitter posts on new infections that people are posting about. Here's only a few the listener found this past month. Woke up coughing blood. COVID symptom, I think 5 or 6 days, getting better, fever down, sneezing down, but I just woke up to cough with blood, nothing, mucus, then cough again, nothing, then a violent cough, a bit of blood. Then I realized walking upstairs had difficulty breathing. Here's another. I'm going to lose my COVID mind. I've been positive for 12 days. I woke up on my birthday violently vomiting with 102 fever. Yay, 35. Tomorrow is day 13. It has royally kicked my ass. Fever, vomiting, cough, awful nose congestion, sore throat, the whole charcuterie board of COVID. Finally, I feel like I was turning the page yesterday afternoon, and today, and wham, bam, started feeling bad like in the past hour. Here's another. I just got COVID for the first time. This is by far the worst virus I have ever had. Day 4, still the worst virus I've had. Ended up in the ER today. Hopefully the Paxlovid they gave me helps. I feel lost, confused, kind of angry in some ways. This is not the mild virus people try to pass it off as. After finally experiencing it for the first time, I'm shocked we aren't talking taking this more seriously. I hope everyone is doing okay, at least better than I am. Here's another. 38 years old, no pre-existing conditions. I'm super healthy. Took COVID seriously since 2020. I was vaxxed twice, but not since late 2021. I don't even get colds, but holy shit, this is bad. First 2 days felt like the worst flu ever. Day 4 feels like the worst cold ever. Sleeping patterns are all messed up. Here's another. Not gonna lie, I've been lax about masking and I caught COVID a second time. From work again, of course. I refuse to get infected again and again and hope for the best. Might fuck around and get something like the flow mask. Here's another. I am losing it. This is the 3rd time I've had COVID in a year, the 2nd time in 4 months. I don't feel really sick. I have a runny nose, basically no sore throat. This feels like nothing compared to the last 2 times. I hate this. I was supposed to run a half marathon this week, and I was supposed to be going home to visit my parents. I can't do anything now. How do I even count this if I was symptomatic as ever on Monday, but a negative PCR. I was outdoors all weekend. Friday night, we went to a movie with 5 people in it. I went to a spin class on Friday morning at 5:30 with like 9 people, far away from others, at the YMCA of mostly senior citizens. That's it. I don't know where I even got this. Now I'm actually reading a bunch of them, a lot more than I thought I would. But I think it's really critical that you hear what your fellow Americans are saying about their infections. Here's another. I've come down with COVID for a 3rd time. Yesterday, after getting back from Dublin, I woke up with a cold, felt familiar, took a test, and yep, COVID. Deteriorated so fast, and last night was awful. Horrible fever, and woke up in the middle of the night feeling like I was dying. Today, I feel marginally better, but still barely, and I couldn't get out of bed until midday. I've had 3 vaccines, but it's been such a long time. I reckon the first time I had it was so mild because I was only a week out from having a vaccine, so I got a head start in fighting it off. Here's another. Feeling depressed and hating myself. There are Uber Eats bags all over my floor. My hair's matted and haven't been washed in 2 weeks. The dishes in my sink are overflowing. I have no appetite and am barely eating. The body aches and fever chills are so painful. They are in my head, neck, joints, arms, legs, and stomach. I can't take painkiller because I've already hit the maximum dose. The throat pain is awful and only getting worse. I feel like knocking myself out. I can't move from my bed. I live alone, so I have no one to help me, and no one can visit me. I feel sad and not human. It feels like this virus will never end, and I can't take it. Okay, a couple more. I think it's important to share these with you. On Monday afternoon, I started feeling throat pain and body aches out of nowhere. A few hours later, my lymph nodes were completely swollen and tender. That night, I got woken up crying because of the body. I woke up crying because of the body and joint aches. It reminded me of the extreme pain I went through when I got my 2nd vaccine. I knew something more was going on. I called the walk-in clinic next to me. The doctor said it was probably just the flu. Didn't bother to test me or anything. Got home, then the fever chill started. When my boyfriend got home, he told me he had some rapid tests. Took one yesterday, and there was just a faint line. But today, I took another 2, and they are definitely positive. By the way, I should say that if you have a faint line, you're definitely positive, okay? She continues, I can barely get out of the bed, and the body aches are so horrible. They make me toss around and cry. The doctor gave me some ibuprofen, but that only helped for yesterday afternoon. I'm also getting horrible joint pain. I'm also a tad worried because I can feel my chest starting to hurt. Here's another one. 8 weeks, remaining symptoms of a very, very weird head, dizzy feeling. Round 3 fucked me up big time. It came 6 weeks after round 2 and has been a massive bastard. My symptoms now are basically all cognitive neurological. I've had this in the past, but this time it literally feels like my brain has been in a blender. I started doing cognitive assessments that I do on patients on myself because I was convinced I have dementia. Obviously I don't, but my brain never felt this weird. The nausea, ill feelings, temps have seemed to settle at the moment, and now I'm just stuck in what feels like the upside down in Stranger Things in my brain. Now we're going to stop there, and we're going to return back to some quant data, but I hope these testimonials make you understand that indeed that the COVID-19 is still very much around, and it is, as in the words of one of our witnesses here, a bastard. Detecting SARS-2 in sewage wastewater remains in place. We see the levels of SARS-2 virus detected in the wastewater, in some ways a leading indicator of the pandemic, for August 14th to the 28th. In the orange and reds, we see a growing rebound with more plants coming in at 60% or more of all the samples in SARS-2 detected taken nationally since December 2021. We see Hawaii, the Bay Area, indeed all of coastal California, Nebraska, Houston, Florida, much of the Southeast, all the way up into the Mid-Atlantic, and now this week, parts of the Northeast in Illinois and Indiana. Now you got to recall only 1,650 of the 16,000 publicly owned wastewater plants are reporting it at all. So again, this is just a snapshot. On the other hand, the more acute measure of changes in sewage loads over the past 15 days shows everybody heating up, some places more than others, particularly Oregon, Colorado, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, a rash in New York State, Maine, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas. We see from Epic hospital reports of ICD-10 codes as of August 31st, continuing surges in COVID infections, positivity, emergency room visits, and hospitalizations. We see both RSV and influenza reports are flat, showing this is no summer flu, as some people are trying to fool themselves or others. Indeed, the CDC's county maps for influenza-like infections for the week ending September 1st shows outside parts of the South, ILI, or influenza-like infections, are minimal nationwide. Here are the 7-day averages of fractions of hospital beds filled by COVID patients in 2,103 hospitals, reporting August 7th to the 13th, as mapped by the People's CDC's Les Schaffer. So August 7th to the 13th, we're a couple weeks back. We see hospitals in orange across the country reporting 5 to 20% of their beds filled with COVID, with newly growing isopleths of orange in the Northwest, in Los Angeles, around Salt Lake City, on Long Island in New York City, and on the Florida coast. We see here in reds and purples with as many as half their beds filled with COVID, San Diego, the Washington State-Idaho border, the Iowa-Missouri border, the D.C.-Baltimore region, now also into Pennsylvania and West New York, and the North Carolina-South Carolina border up into Tennessee. The outbreak stateside continues to evolve, as it has been doing so on the global stage, right? So here we have a broader mix of sublineages in play compared to previous months, including in order of prevalence, e.g. 5, suddenly FL 1.5.1, XBB 1.16, XBB 2.3, XBB 1.16.6, among a list of others. Here's the 21-day trend of all the genetic sequences of detected sublineages in the U.S. as of August 31st, including their geographic origins. We see that surge in FL 1.5.1 in peach, centered in New York. We see various XBB 1.16s in green across the country, various EG.5s in red, and the declining XBB 1.5 in orange. Here's a 60-day trend of all the genetic sequences of detected sublineages in New York City alone as of August 11th. Like other international cities, New York City serves as an attractor for strains emerging around the world and as a petri dish in which the virus may experiment with the kinds of recombinations that can accelerate it beyond both vaccines and population immunity, as we discussed earlier. Now, this was our percent population with an updated booster as of May 11th, when CDC cut off sharing these data. Now, this is hardly the kind of coverage for even the kind of herd immunity minimizers claim possible, much less for a virus that continues to evolve out from underneath vaccines and natural immunity. Especially when the darkest blue here on this map, it's only for 25% of the population or more. Now, this was to be our major tool, as the Biden administration calls it, against the SARS-2 virus, rationalizing the end of nearly all non-pharmaceutical interventions, including in hospitals. And our booster has been limited to once a year now, even as SARS-2 is decidedly on something other than influenza's seasonal schedule. There's a lot more SARS-2 variants emerging from month to month than influenzas. So we're going to stop there for now. That's the end of the first part of our COVID This Week episode. And you can find our second part linked in the video description below. You can find all our episodes on the People CDC's YouTube channel. And you can learn more about the People CDC and read this week's COVID weather report at our website, peoplecdc.org.